went back down to Merimbula for a funeral. And there was a couple of boys talking about getting some abs there, so I thought, oh, bugger this, so I'll give the meatworks away and stayed at Eden for quite a number of years. We were snorkeling that was in 62 when I was there, 63 when I went back to Eden. It was just starting to pay good money then. We could make £100 a day, which everyone was ranting and raving about. I reckon that was pretty good, so did we. And a lot of divers was starting to come around. Cecil Chan was a notable man, they had a good crew of divers, mostly Islander boys, and one Maori, the Black Flash, who was possibly the best ab diver we've ever had. Yeah, I just stayed there till, I think it was, I just forget what date it was when we had to make a decision whether we wanted to stay in New South Wales diving and work the coast. I had a 36-footer down there, the old Lass. It was an old boat that my grandfather had owned at one time, taking oysters down to the Wingen. Getting there, not taking them down there, going down there picking up seed oysters out of the Wingen inlet. So anyway, I finished up having that for probably 4 years, fishing that with another mate, couple of mates, Donny Hayes and little Sonny, a Maori mate of mine. He was our deck man. Or by that time too, we graduated to hookers, self-made hookers. But before that, I had tanks. Oh, before that again too, I rebuilt a boat at Merimbula, on the Merimbula Lakes there for about 7 months. About a 24-footer, I reckon. Was an old Queenscliff Cooter boat years ago, owned by a bloke named Jack Gray, long dead now. So we used to fish down there and down around the coast, all the way down to Everard with that, because we could in those days between the states. But then they made the decision you'd have to change or have a licence there, and so I moved then to Malakuta for a while. Then they brought in the high licence for you those days, a £200 one, and sort of thinned the ranks a little bit. 66 was when I went to Portland. There was the Flash, myself, Johnny Munn. So we had the winter down in Portland. Portland didn't impress me that much. It was plenty of abs when you could work. But my cousin, Johnny Munn, was the other one. His girlfriend's sister was down in Ocean Grove, so we went down for a few days to have a look at the water and for him to catch up with family. And technically, outside of going back to get me gear, I haven't left the place for 50 bloody years. Still here. I give diving away about 15 years ago. I've got one son is diving again now, and another one fishing wrasse, because licences and everything, it's a very different scene these days. Too costly in my view. Too target Pacific, which I don't think is necessarily a good thing for the species. When Grandad died, no, it was before that, I went up and seen old Pa, because he was in his 90s then, and he offered me his oyster leases. He'd remarried a young bird of 60 odd, and he said, I haven't got long to go, and if you look after Mum, you can have half now and have the lot when she goes. But I knew a bit about oysters, being in the family in the background. It was just like water dairy farming, and you had to be there too regular for the tide, walking around a water order. I said, sorry, Pa. I said, thanks for the offer, but I said, I don't want to be walking in bloody water all day, every day of the rest of my life. And as it turned out, I spent 40 years under the bloody stuff. Which I always thought was a bit ironical, really. He would have loved to have heard that, because he was a rugged old character.
Tas was a fisherman. He wasn't an abalone diver, he was a fisherman. He was, a lot of the work we did, there was no GPS, it was, there was lots of landmarks. He was very traditional. He used to harp on to me all the time about, being organised and the discipline of having the gear ready and that kind of stuff. And for which, when I was so young, I didn't realise it was such a big deal. But now that I'm a bit older, I certainly see where he was coming from. But Yeah, no, lots of landmarks. Yeah, just a very traditional sort of a fisherman, and yeah, he wasn't just an ab diver.
Oh, there's been the usual bad weather things in small boats overloaded. I come through the rip with nearly a tonne of fish on a 474 stacer one time, and it was pretty awful. I tell you, good wind against the tide coming in, and
we didn't have that much horsepower on. She wasn't moving too quick, but she split the hull. We were leaking pretty badly. I was on the back deck with a 20-litre bucket, just scooping it off the back deck as quick as I could go. Tas had the goggles on to see where it was going, looking over the front, and she was wearing them pretty hard.
I'm full to the brim, not an inch to spare, and I'm looking at her thinking which bag I'll throw over, and every time I got over a bloody bad spot, I put the thought out of my mind. I eventually got in, but I was probably pretty stupid doing that.
We got back to Queensland and got on the boat on a trailer, and she had about a 10 or 12 inch split up on the shoulder, up on the chine, and yeah, it was pretty dodgy by the time we got back to the Queensland Creek. She was pretty. There was a lot of water in it, a lot of abs, but yeah, it was just one of those days.
Another time at the rip, I was anchored on the Pean, and the tide turned, and she was coming full bore, but I had a raw decky with me that had no idea about the weather and conditions actually. And I nearly made it to the back of the boat, and he couldn't get me bag or me, and so then took me out full length of the hose, 100 metres. And I was neither, because of the weight of the bag, and I wasn't dropping the bloody thing, I was mid-water, but I couldn't pull against it. But fortunately another old fisherman down there, a bloke, old Bluey Welsh, said, "Cut the bloody ropes, you fool." So he cut the anchor and I was sweet, then boat come back to me and I popped up. But if he hadn't come along, I would have been buggered, because I'd tied the rope, not tied the rope, but my hose, and the bag sort of looped around myself, and the tide was too good to undo it. So yeah, I would have been a goner there, I reckon, except that old Bluey. But I know been in some pretty good bloody weather, a southeast gale going back from Gabo, and my little boat, the Cuddy Sark we called it, a little rebuilt bloody cooter boat, full of abs and 3 blokes on board, and it was pretty bloody big. Southeast gale down there is pretty nasty on coming back up from Gabo. But again, we got through that all right. But other than that, only the usual weather mishaps. I had a shark cat here years ago, one of the very first. It was the second shark cat by Bruce Harris in Victoria, I believe. Quite a crude version from what he eventually finished up with, 18 foot. I had my daughter on board and a mate and his wife, and I must have hit a bottle on the way out. And they were fishing there, and they were just sightseeing, enjoying the day. And I come up and I said, "We'll go home after this bag." And he said, "Righto." But what I didn't know, the holes were filling up full of water from this hole, and they had no division in the top section, so it was going over into the next hole. And when I come up, my mate walked down to get the bag, took the bag all right, but because he was down in before he took the bag up towards the bow, and I just went straight down again, and the boat upended on him. My daughter was trapped inside the cabin, and I told him prior, "Just give us a pull when you're ready then." And of course he's pulling and I'm pulling back, and then after a while I said, "Christ almighty, he's already told me that I've come up and I'm on the way." So I come up, then I noticed a few fish and things going past in the tide. So I scrambled up there straight away to see the bloody boat upside down, head in the water with my daughter trapped in the cabin. And she's little legs kicking away, she was quite young. So I pulled her out, and I think I've never been prouder of her in my life. When I said, "Weren't you scared?" She said, "No, I knew you'd come." Made me feel 10 foot tall actually. It was a bloody marvellous experience. I get a funny feeling just talking about it. That's 40 years ago or something now. Yeah, long time ago. But no, I don't consider it anything real dangerous. I think I've had closer scrapes on the road when I was a young fella a couple of times, you know. A couple of sharks, nothing again dangerous. They weren't in the mood to have a meal, so I was happy about that. But I think anyone that's been at sea's experienced, plenty of storm weather. In Melbourne's big storm, I don't know when that was, when it blackened over at lunchtime here, I think that was in the 70s, 100-mile-hour winds and that. I was out in that and got washed ashore just east of Sorrento. But because I knew the rocks, I was able to steer the boat in between them and beached her. And that night, about 4 hours later, debated. We pushed her out and come home. Another time, similar thing, another big storm we had here too. There was 100-mile-hour winds too in Melbourne. I was fishing off of Kirk's Point, Point Cook actually, back between the two of them, when the blow come away, and I was only in my big boat dinghy because I had at one stage too, I had a 50-footer I was fishing down around the prom and what have you from out of Queenscliff. And so the deckie I had, they've been with me quite a bit. And when he pulled me up, I said, why didn't you pull me a bit before? But you left a bit late. I couldn't even make it to shore. And it blew its bloody tits off, and then by the time I had to run with it, I had no option. And yet we was almost, not even 10 yards off the shore, but couldn't make it. So I just went with it, and he's bailing like blazes. Only time I'd ever seen him quiet, actually. And anyway, that was a bit hairy. I wouldn't say scary, but hairy. Only time I'd ever seen Norm serious, me mate. But yeah. But yeah, I think they were a couple of the notable times, really, particularly those two storms were rather amazing. Yeah. In the early days when we were snorkeling, you'd get some big boulder country, which you couldn't reach, but you'd see some bloody good abs down there. Big old abs, So you get those prickly starfish, and you drop a couple of them down and come back half an hour or so later, and Abalone being a snail, he's up and off, and those bloody things are after him, so they were easy pickings, but you had to wait a while. But yeah, we did that a fair bit actually, the same up in New South Wales and down here. That's again only when we were snorkeling, because there was a couple of long-term snorkelers very early in the industry. There was Frank Matthews and Levin. They kept going for a long time around seal rocks and that. The seals, when you dive in amongst them or dive in where a colony is, it was the same down at New South Wales too, the scaries. If you're diving near the school and that there's plenty of them, and you dive down through them, they look like bloody sardines when they're really thick. But they don't worry you, they're very inquisitive, they just prop up like a big dog looking at you, and they'd nibble the top of your head, but not actually punch you or anything. They just wanted the air bubbles, I think, had them excited. It's beautiful to see, really. But first up, the first few times you ever see them, they'd have a habit of whistling by you flat out, and you think, Christ, what, is that a shark or what? And that instant you jump, because you just don't know they're that fast. But they're very playful critters. Although on the New South Wales coast they had a big bull. I was in about 30 metres, I suppose, and down near the New South Victorian border. And I had a big bag of abs, and he wanted it more than what I did, and he worried me a bit. I finished up letting him have it anyway. But that's the only time they'd ever really actively annoyed me, yeah. No, whenever I've been in amongst those places where they're thick, I think it's just a congregation point of them. I don't think any fish should have the brains to be anywhere near them, to tell you the truth. So I don't know about that. I do know that occasionally, if they all disappear, you get a bit concerned, for sure, because you think, what the bloody hell's going on, But I've never had any trouble in that area. Although I did see up at the island off of out from Port Ferry there. That's your country there. What's that place?
Julia Percy Island?
Julia Person there. I've seen the seal getting bit in half once. But it was just a flash and bang, and there's half a seal there and a bloody floating body. I got out, I thought it's time for me to get out of the water. It was only the one, so I only ever went over there a couple of times actually. Yeah, I did have the bends slightly at Malakuta one time. I come in, it was in my leg. And as in those days, that would have been in about 65, I suppose, 65. And it was just painful. But I spent the day out of the water and it resumed all right. So I don't know how I went with that type of illness and the bone necrosis. I think my bones are not in bad shape, but I don't know. Yeah.
So you didn't dive deep very much?
We did, but then we'd work our way inshore mostly. Actually, we did have a lecture down there one time by an American doctor that come around. He started his conversation off by saying he's looking at a room full of dead men. We was in a little hall there at Malakuta. He went on to say a whole lot of things, but there's only a couple of us ever subscribed to anything bad. Yeah, Malakuta, yeah, it was a great place. A lot of bottom, all the way from outside, all the way right down to the prom, which is now Point Hicks. No, not the prom, I mean Point Hicks now. Cape Everard, big ram, little ram and that. My little boat that I rebuilt, the Cuddy Sark, the little Cooter boat. Donny Hayes and myself there one day. I don't know, I've tried to find this photo, but we had that boat, that load of the stern, she was bloody nearly sinking with spud bags full of bloody Abalone. We were on hooker at that time. No, tanks I think we might have been on. But yeah, there were plenty of abs there. It was a very, very productive area. In fact, around, even on the east side of Cooter, of Gabo, I remember me and Donnie out there one day and we were tank diving for shore then, and we said to each other, you know, if you couldn't get 2 bins of meat on a tank of air, you'd bloody nearly have to give the game away. And yeah, beautiful runs of fish and plenty of them. And they were quite shallow then, right up to the shoreline on the east side. Yeah.
So a lot of abs there. Was there many crays there, Malakuta?
Well, the cray fishermen never made any big fortune, but they did all right, and we certainly had plenty to eat without any trouble. The general, yeah, it was just a good marine area all the way through. They're very healthy in that. A lot of fish. The salmon used to come through and go up the coast well from there. Just a good all-round area.
Down on that?
Yeah, well, it's funny because when I first started spearfishing and that, you'd pick your weather a bit better too, but quite often we'd only have 2 jumpers on, one upside down and one on you. It didn't take long to think there's got to be something better than this, so we looked at some wetsuits, which were usually pretty rugged compared to what they got these days. They'd chafe you a lot and it wasn't as good a fit, the rubber wasn't as good. That was a major improvement coming through. Once it started, come very quickly. It was the same with the air situation. Like when we first started, there was no off-the-shelf hooker units. We made our own. In fact, I dived with even before, in 1960 when I first came home from New Zealand, where I went over fishing and whatever, but I dived with a bloke, Coffee. He was the first bloke I knew. He made his own air compressor out of a motorbike engine, and you could do 60 feet with it with a piece of garden hose, and that was my first diving with him. He's a well-known diver on the rigs and what have you. As I said, on my boat, the little cutty, I had tanks on that when we did first start up a bit. went to Melbourne, Sydney and bought an old 3-stage compressor out of an aircraft, wartime thing, and we used that with a few filters and bloody filled our own bottles up. And I had about 16 tanks at one stage on the boat. And the funny thing, when you think back, one day you got none and you sort of say, where'd they go? And honestly, we don't know. Another good mate of mine that worked with me a lot down in Eden was Donny Hayes, who's at Malakuta. In fact, Donny, in my mind, invented the first parachute, because prior to that we'd used plastic bags and nothing, And I think if I've got a claim to fame that nobody knows about, is I needed the first net bag as far as I'm concerned, and actually lost that in St Helens Bay.
And before that?
Before that we'd used spud bags and sugar bags and tyres just to float them around. We'd just pop up and throw them in there and drag them ashore. But that only lasted, say, a couple of years most, if that. But as soon as we started making money, so I don't know where the innovations come from, really. Boats was out of our reach when we first started, so then as soon as you got onto something, then you started to involve much quicker.
So the cold, tell us about the cold. You must have suffered from the cold, did you?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the cold was, particularly in those early days, I'd come out, you just couldn't feel your hands or feet. And I used to smoke in the early days, even when I was snorkeling a lot, but you couldn't roll a smoke, out of the question. Fingers just weren't working right. But yeah, and we tried, again with the evolution of gear, we tried hot water being pumped down to us. Wasn't real successful, you see it'd fill up. It's all right when you're in the bottom to a point, but you finished up like a whale. Just so bulky and that, but that warm water was pretty good in the winter time, particularly in Port Phillip Bay, which is very cold. But a couple of the boys tried dry suits, but they never really evolved either, not in the industry.
What was the problem with the dry suit?
To be honest, I don't know. I think mainly because we used to have a lot of 7 and 8 hour days, and I think nature might have called a bit with the dry suits. Yeah. In fact, one of the boys, even with the wetsuits, Tommy Ryan, he cut a little flap, had a flap there so he could go. The rest of us generally just enjoyed that upside down warm water. There was a couple of women, yeah. Particularly in Tassie, I think was where one of the first full-time ones was. And there was one decky woman here in Victoria for a long time on one of the boats. At least one. Other than that, I don't really know of any others, I don't think. I would have known, I'm sure I would have remembered. But
why don't you think there was more women divers?
Yeah, good question. I don't know. I know that they certainly liked the lifestyle of Abalone given, but I just don't think at that time. Diving was a funny industry when we first started, because it was an unknown thing, and there was times you'd go somewhere and people, they'd almost treat you like a bloody, not a pop star's too strong a word, but they were extremely interested in what you're doing and where you're going and what's happening, and so you made friends very easily because they wanted to know what's going on. And I don't know why women, I don't know, there just wasn't many women fishermen or divers. Although my mother, she worked on the big boat with Dad in the Tassie in the late 50s. And then when he came over to fishing in lakes, entrance trawling, because he loved trawling. I didn't like trawling because we're still seeing a trawling here. I was out of trawling in New Zealand, and I come back and said that's the way to go, and everyone said he's this cheeky young kid saying that. But these days they're all bloody out of trawlers. But with seeing trawling, I have got a photo of that. You spend all your bloody time off work sitting on a bloody wharf mending nets, and so it wasn't really my bag. and that's why I didn't go trawler fishing with Dad when I came home from New Zealand. He wanted me to, but it wasn't my bag. The dinghy lads, they were very important in the really early days. They were important. They were an important part of our industry because they looked after you all the time, and when you come up, particularly when we were still on aqualungs, they didn't know where you was, and they just had to follow your bubbles and be there when you decided to come up. So communication was at nil. And yeah, they were very important and to look after you and to take the abs and carry them backwards and forwards and come back with other bags or have them there for you in the dinghies. But yeah, it was good and bad. But yeah, one bloke I had, big tall fella, and he came away with me, and when he's trying to lift a bag up onto the bigger boat, he couldn't understand why it all turned over. And I said, well, you ever look at your size and you've got a bloody 100-pound up around your head on the side of a little boat, it's got to bloody turn over. Well, he did that about 4 times before he actually woke up. We'd have to go and get this bloody bag that he'd dropped, you know. But no, and they were all our mates. They were all quite an important part of what we were doing.
Probably one day that sticks in my memory was on the outer point Lonsdale reef. There's a rock pool there, and in the southeast corner of that rock pool, we'd been sweating on it for ages. Tas knew that there was plenty of abs there. Well, I went and got him out of bed at about, must have been about 4:30, 5 o'clock in the summertime. It was a dead flat, calm day. The tide was right, and yeah, we were on the road at 5:30, and we went into this rock pool. We got in there easily enough, and in the bottom corner of it, we had, I think we had a bit over 1,100 kilo for the morning, and we were back in the Ozone Hotel, unloaded, having a camel lunch by 12:15. And yeah, that was a really good day. And the bubbles hardly moved from under the boat. I anchored the boat up, and the Tas just hardly moved. It was fabulous. One little corner down there, and on the outside of the reef there was another gulch that came in from the outside, and I thought, geez, if they're good here, they must be good there, because that wouldn't have been touched for years either. But yeah, we never got back to it. And I never ran up the driveway again at 5 in the morning either, because Lynn, Tas's wife, she had a bit of a go at me later on for that. She said 5 o'clock in the morning was a bit too early for her, and she did chat me about that. It was she wasn't too happy.
Yeah, I did most of my life anchored up, although I worked solo a lot too, particularly here in Victoria. But yeah, live, I don't really know when live diving come in. Say in the 90s, I suppose. It come in when transferability came about. The transferability created a different form of diving altogether. It became very commercial. People, yeah, I consider it. It over-commercialised the industry, I think. A lot of the other divers were getting a bit older and sold out, or leased their licences. Leased divers had to get a lot more fish to make big money, and they all wanted to make big money. So I think that's when the industry started to be overfished. But they had to do something, I suppose. There needed to be opportunities. Until transferability come in, there was no opportunities for people to get into the industry other than through on leash diving or something. That both of those things come in together pretty close.
So the difference between greens and blacks, can you tell us why what one type favours and not the other? What bottom you find them on?
Oh well, the green lip, he's a much bigger species, and he's more of a flat rock sand dweller. I don't know enough about the weed characteristics. I know it when I'm in the water, but not by name. I think, and the black lip's a cryptic hide fish more than the green lip. So the green lip you'll find on relatively open spaces, on leaving this floor, big, you know, if that's the right country, nice big round boulder, he'll be there, not worried about the predators, to put it, I guess. Whereas the black lip, and I'd say the black lip shell's definitely softer than the green lip. So I think he's a bit game of species. And the black lip, because he's more secretive in the dark holes and crevices, etc. The green lip as a species, for taste and that, I don't believe there's any difference, really difference, but he's certainly a much cleaner, appealing fish to look at. Nice pale green fish and much bigger in size, so, but that's a visual thing, I think. I don't think there's any difference in flavour. Green lips like tide water. Black lips, yeah, I think they're more, again, because of their cryptic habit, they get in under the boulders and that, they'll be anywhere. You can often get them right up to the shorelines in quite rough water, and they'll be there. If you can, yeah, they'll be there in many cases, under bull kelp and everything, but you won't find a green lip in country like that, or I haven't.
Well, must have been a bit of subterfuge at times as to if you're on a patch.
Yeah, I remember once talking on places to go. In the old days, before it became as popular as it is today, and without all the modern aids that we've got these days, people would follow you if you come home with a good catch, so you'd try to put them off. And I remember, again, in the cuddy, me and Donnie, we went down to the Gabo, out the front end of Gabo, out about 150 foot of water, and pretended we were diving because we could see someone coming down in the speedboat, because I was a bit late getting into the fast boats. And so we're fishing there and have the lines under, the boys down, and I say, oh, geez, we didn't think you'd be down, know where we are here. Anyway, they all suited up and jumped in the water, and we pissed off because they caught us 10 minutes later. Yeah, so. Yeah, so there was certainly a bit of substitute going, or you'd leave late and go and get your spot and get home quick, and because you can only catch them once, so obviously you tried to be a bit guarded. I don't think it was a particularly selfish industry, but you certainly tried to guard your spot, you know. Ricky Hale, yeah, the Black Flash, he was just an athlete. He was a well-built lad and a worker, and everything he did do spot on. He was very fast in the water. He'd double nearly anyone, most times. I did work with him at Portland, and I tried my hardest, but I was always a bin behind him. And that's when, yeah, he went away one time. We'd always top bait, and then we'd get away one way. He inspired me. I was top bait for the 2 days he went away. But no, you couldn't. Most people couldn't hold a candle to him. I certainly couldn't. The other one, I believe I can be credited with giving JC his name. It was at my cousin's restaurant in Eden, and we come out just on dark after a meal, and there's Phil, just fresh from university, and his wife, or his girlfriend then. Big strapping bloke, beautiful long hair. Any girl would give a quid for ever, you know. And big beard, and I said, Jesus, there's JC. And that was all it took. It stuck to him the rest of his life. Another good friend. I'm still friendly with Phil. Been a bit crook lately. Johnny, my cousin, Johnny Munn, he was a good diver. He was a great spear fisherman, Johnny. They used to have a lot of New South Wales championships once a year at Merimbula and Eden. And Johnny would always clean them up, and they'd reckon most of the big champions of the day would say, oh, he's had fish hidden, but he hidden. I know when I was diving with him, I was a better skin air diver than John. Diver, but nowhere near the spear fisherman he was either. Very accurate and had good knowledge of the habitat, you know. But
what was the worst thing about Abalone?
Oh, that's a hard one. The worst thing about ab diving, it's pretty hard. I don't know whether it's nostalgic or not. I'm struggling to find anything bad about it, to tell you the truth.
Okay, well, what was the best thing about ab diving?
Freedom. Freedom. Freedom and independence, I'd say. As I said, it beat working for a living. And yet in actual fact you did work bloody hard. But if your mind's right, Dad used to say to me, he said, if you like what you're doing, it's not work. And I guess that's Abalone. Although some of the other best divers I know, I can't remember the name offhand, but they didn't like it, but they loved money. And I think that's a big difference too.